I was now living at the miller's, and the villagers nicknamed Jealous. He was more taciturn than usual in the area. Even when neighbors came to pay him a visit, he would just sit, taking an occasional sip of vodka, and drawling out the word once in a while, lost, or staring at a dried-up fly on the wall. He abandoned his revelry only when his wife entered the room. Equally quiet and taciturn, she would always sit down beside her husband, modestly dropping her gaze when men entered the room and furtively glanced at her. I slept in the attic, directly above the bedroom. At night I was awakened by the quarrels. The miller suspected his wife of flirting and lasciviously displaying her body in the fields and the mill before a young plowboy. His wife did not deny this, but sat passive and still. Sometimes the quarrel did not end. The enraged miller lit candles in the room, put on his boots, and beat his wife. I would cling to a crack in the floorboards and watch the miller lashing his naked wife with a horsewhip. The woman cowered behind his feather quill. The woman cowered behind a feathered quilt tugged off of the bed, but the man pulled it away, flung it to the floor, and standing over her with his legs spread wide, continued to lash her plump body with a whip. After every stroke, red blood-swollen lines would appear on her tender skin. The miller was merciless. With a grand sweep of arm, he looped his leather thong and whipped her over and over. Her buttocks and thighs, slashed her breasts and neck, scourged her shoulders and shins. The woman weakened and lay whining like a puppy. Then she crawled towards her husband's legs, begging forgiveness. Finally, the miller threw down the whip, and after blowing out the candle, went to bed. The woman remained groaning. The following day she would cover her wounds, move with difficulty, and wipe away her tears with bruised, cut palms. There was another inhabitant of the hut, a well-fed tabby cat. One day she was seized by a frenzy. Instead of mewing, she emitted a half-smothered squeals. She slid along the walls, and sinuously as a snake, swung her pulsating flanks and clawed at the skirts of the miller's wife. She growled at the strange voice and moaned. Her raucous shrieks made everyone restless. At dusk the tabby whined insanely, her tail beating her flanks, her nose thrusting. The miller locked the inflamed female in the cellar and went to the mill, telling his wife that he would bring the plowboy home for supper. Without a word, the woman set about preparing the food and the table. The plowboy was an orphan. It was his first season to work in the miller's farm. He was tall, reticent youth with flaxen hair, which he habitually pushed back from his sweating brow. The miller knew that the villagers gossiped about his wife and the boy. It was said that she changed when she gazed into the boy's blue eyes. Heedless of this risk of being noticed by her husband, she impulsively hiked her skirt high above her knees with one hand, and with the other pushed down the bodice of her dress to display her heaving breast, all the time staring at the boy's eyes. The miller returned with the young man, carrying in a sack slung over his shoulder a tomcat borrowed from the neighbor. The tomcat had a head as large as a turnip and a long, strong tail. The tabby was howling, lusting in the cellar. When the miller released her, she sprang into the center of the room. The two cats began to circle one another, mistrustfully, panting, coming nearer and nearer. The miller's wife served supper. They ate silently. The miller sat in the middle of the table, his wife on one side and the plowboy on the other. I ate my portion squatting by the oven. I admired the appetites of the two men. Huge chunks of meat and bread, washed down with gulps of vodka, disappeared in their throats like hazelnuts. The woman was the only one who chewed her food slowly. When she bowed her head low over the bowl, the plowboy would dart a glance faster than lightning at her bulging bodice. In the center of the room, the tabby suddenly arched her body, bared her teeth and claws, and pounced on the tomcat. He halted, stretched his back, and spurting saliva straight into her inflamed eyes. The female circled him, leaped towards him, recoiled, then struck him in the muzzle. Now the tomcat stalked around her cautiously, sniffing her intoxicating odor. He arched his tail and tried to come at her from the rear, but the female would not let him. She flattened her body on the floor and turned like a millstone, striking his nose with a stiff, outstretched paws. Fascinated, the miller and the other two stared silently while eating. The woman sat with a flushed face. Even her neck was reddening. The plowboy raised his eyes, only to drop them at once. Sweat ran through his short hair, and he continually pushed it away from his hot brow. Only the miller sat calmly eating, watching the cats and glancing casually at his wife and guest. The tomcat suddenly came to a decision. His movement became lighter. He advanced. She moved playfully, as if to draw back, but the male leaped high and flopped onto her with all fours. He sank his teeth into her neck and intently, tauntingly, plunged directly into her without any squirming. When satiated and exhausted, he relaxed. The tabby nailed to the floor, screamed shrilly, and sprang out from under him. She jumped onto the cooled oven and tossed about it like a fish, looping her paws over her neck, rubbing her head against the warm wall. The miller's wife and the plowboy ceased eating. They stared at each other, gasping over their food-filled mouths. The woman breathed heavily, placing her hands under her large, heaving breast, and squeezed them, clearly unaware of herself. The plowboy looked alternately at the cats and at her, licked his dry lips, and got down his food with difficulty. The miller swallowed the last of his meal, leaned his head back, and abruptly gulped down a glass of vodka. Though drunk, he got up and grasped his iron spoon and tapped it. He approached the plowboy. The youth sat bewildered. The woman hitched up her skirt and began puttering at the fire. The miller bent over to the plowboy and whispered something in his reddening ear. The youth jumped up as if pricked with a knife and began to deny something. The miller asked loudly now whether the boy lusted after his wife. The plowboy blushed but did not answer. The miller's wife, breathing heavily, turned away and continued to clean the pots. The miller pointed at the strolling tomcat and again whispered something to the youth. The latter, with an effort, rose from the table, intending to leave the room. The miller came forward, overturned his stool, and before the youth realized it, suddenly pushed him against the wall, pressing an arm against his throat, and drove a knee into his stomach. The boy could not move. Terror-stricken, panting loudly, he babbled something. The woman dashed towards her husband, imploring and wailing. The awakened tabby cat, lying in the oven, looked down at the spectacle, while a frightened tomcat leapt onto the table. With a single kick, The miller got the woman out of his way, and with a rapid movement such as women used to gouge out the rotten spots with peeling potatoes, he plunged the spoon into the boy's eyes and twisted it. The eye sprang out of his face like a yolk from a broken egg and rolled down the miller's hand into the floor. The plowboy howled and shrieked. The miller's hold kept him pinned against the wall. Then the blood-covered spoon plunged into the other eye, which sprang out even faster. For a moment the eye rested on the boy's cheek, as if uncertain what to do next. Then it finally tumbled down the shirt to the floor. It all happened in a moment. I could not believe what I had seen. Something like a glimmer of hope crossed my mind that the gouged eye could be put back where they belonged. The miller's wife was screaming wildly. She rushed to the adjoining room and woke up her children, who had started crying in terror. The plowboy howled loudly, then grew silent, covered his face with his hands. Rivulets of blood seeped through his fingers, down his arms, dripped slowly down his shirt and trousers. The miller, still enraged, pushed him towards the window, as though unaware the youth was blind. He stumbled, cried out, nearly knocked over the table. The miller grabbed him by the shoulders, opened the door with his foot, and kicked him out. The boy yelled again, stumbled to the doorway, and fell out to the yard. The dogs started barking, though they did not know what had happened. The eyeballs lay on the floor. They walked around them, catching their steady stare. The cats timidly moved out to the middle of the room and began to play with their eyes as if they were balls of thread. Their own pupils narrowed to slits from lights of the oil lamp. The cats rolled the eyes around, sniffed them, licked them, and passed them to one another gently with their patting paws. Now it seemed that the eyes were staring at me from every corner of the room, as though they had acquired a life of their motion of their own. I watched them with fascination. If the miller had not been there, I myself might have taken them. Surely they could still see. I would keep them in my pocket and take them out when I needed, placing them over my own. Then I would see twice as much, maybe even more. Perhaps I could attach them to the back of my head, and would tell me, although not quite certain how, what went on behind me. Better still, I could leave the eyes somewhere, and they would tell me later what happened during my absence. Maybe the eyes had no intention of serving anyone. They could easily escape from the cats and roll out into the door, and wander off the fields, lakes, and woods, viewing everything about them, free as birds released from a trap. They would no longer die, since they were free, and being small, they could easily hide in various places and watch people in secret. Excited, I decided to close the door quietly and capture the eyes. The miller, evidently annoyed at the cat's play, kicked the animals away and squashed the eyeballs with his heavy boots. Something popped under his thick sole. A marvelous mirror, which could reflect the whole world, was broken. There, remaining on the floor on only crushed bits of jelly, I felt a terrible sense of loss. The miller, paying no attention to me, seated himself on the bench and swayed slowly as he fell asleep. I stood up cautiously, lifted the bloodied spoon from the floor, and began to gather the dishes. It was my duty to keep the room neat and the floor swept. As I cleaned, I kept away from the crushed eyes, uncertain what to do with them. Finally I looked away and quickly swept the ooze into the pail and threw it into the oven. In the morning I awoke early. Underneath me I heard the miller and his wife snoring. Carefully I packed a sack of food, loaded the comet with hot embers, and bribing the dog in the yard with a piece of sausage, I fled from the hut. At the mill wall, next to the barn, lay the plowboy. At first I meant to pass him quickly, but I stopped when I realized that he was sightless. He was still stunned. He covered his face with his hands. He moaned and sobbed. There were caked blood in his face, hands, and shirt. I wanted to say something, but I was afraid that he would ask me about his eyes, and then I would have to tell him to forget about them, as the miller had stamped them into pulp. I was terribly sorry for him. I wondered whether loss of one's sight would deprive a person also of the memory of everything that he had seen before. If so, the man would no longer be able to even see in his dreams. If not, if only the eyeless would still see in their memory, it would not be too bad. The world seemed to be pretty much the same everywhere, and even though people differed from one another, just as animals and trees did, one could know fairly well that they looked like after them. One could know fairly well what they looked like after seeing them for years. I had lived only 7 years, but I remembered a lot of things. When I closed my eyes, many details came back still more vividly. Who knows? Perhaps with his eyes and Plowboy would start seeing an entirely new, more fascinating world. I heard some sound from the village. Afraid that the miller might wake up, I went on my way. Touching my eye from time to time, I walked more cautiously now, for I knew the eyeball did not have strong roots. When one bent down, they hung like apples from trees and could easily drop out. I resolved to jump across the fences with my head held up, but on my first try I stumbled and fell down. I lifted my fingers fearfully to my eyes to see whether they were still there. After carefully checking, they opened and closed properly. I noticed with delight that the partridges and thrusted in flight. They flew very fast, but my sight could follow them and overtake them as they soared in the clouds, becoming smaller than raindrops. I made a promise to myself to remember everything I saw. If someone should pluck out my eyes, then I would retain the memory of it all that I had seen for as long as I lived.